All right. So good afternoon. I think this may be it, y'all. I think we may be live on this wonderful Wednesday afternoon on Happy Women's Equality Day. My name is Bridget Russell. I'm Director of Marketing and Public Relations at the Columbus Museum. I am so excited to be here with my colleague, Rebecca Bush, Curator of History and Exhibitions Manager at the museum, and also with Sylvia Marshall, who is a former intern for the Columbus Museum, and I'll let them tell you a little bit more about themselves shortly. But I would like to welcome everyone to the historic women's suffrage marker dedication and discussion this afternoon. We are very, very excited because of course we've been working with Historic Columbus to publicize the marker dedication designating Columbus, Georgia, as the birthplace of the women's suffrage movement in Georgia. And that's absolutely amazing to me. So I think Rebecca and Sylvia, before we get started with our discussion, we are going to hear some greetings from Lisa Goodwin, who is Deputy Director for the City of Columbus. So give me just 1 second, you all, to cue that up. I've been saying that there is a second career for me, I think, in TV production at this point. But give me a few minutes and we will hear from Miss Lisa Goodwin. All right, y'all, give me just 1 minute here. Again, those TV producers will have some technical difficulties. So how about while I get this queued up, Rebecca, you tell us a little bit more about today being Women's Equality Day, and you and Sylvia can get started a bit.
Sure. So welcome everyone. We're thrilled to have you with us today. Today is, as Bridget mentioned, Women's Equality Day. So you might be wondering exactly what that means and why it is today, because you also might have seen a lot of women's suffrage centennial observations last week, and you might be thinking, well, what's the difference between August 18th and August 26th? So August 18th, 1920 is the day that Tennessee ratified the 19th Amendment to the Constitution, which said that access to voting and suffrage could not be restricted on the basis of sex. And so on that day, that's the day, once Tennessee ratified, they were the last state necessary. As you know, there's always 3/4 of states have to ratify an amendment to the Constitution before it actually becomes law. First, Congress passes an amendment, which happened in the summer of 1919. Then it goes to the states for ratification, and it took about a year for all those ratifications to come together. So on August 18th, last Tuesday, we celebrated Tennessee ratifying that amendment. And then on August 26th, 1920, that is the date that Congress certifies that ratification and officially adopts the 19th Amendment. So as you can imagine, there's a little bit of lag time. There's about a week's worth in there for, you can think of it almost as the paperwork getting processed before it becomes officially official and becomes the law of the land. So for several years now, August 26th has been celebrated as Women's Equality Day in the US, and is an opportunity to recognize all the advances that women have made in our country and around the world, but also recognizing how far we have to go in a lot of ways. So that's why we are so excited to be dedicating this marker and having this conversation today. And I'm really excited to have Sylvia with me. Hi, Sylvia.
Hi.
And Sylvia, I'll tell you a little bit about Sylvia Marshall. She's a native of Columbus. And Sylvia, which high school did you graduate from?
Columbus High School.
Columbus High grad. She's a recent graduate of Agnes Scott College, where she earned a BA in History and Anthropology. Her focus includes research on African American and Southern history and culture in the 19th and 20th centuries. She's volunteered at the DeKalb History Center in Decatur, researching local DeKalb history and writing blog posts for that organization. She's also organized and digitized photographs from Bibb City as an intern at the Columbus State University Archives. And she greatly aided in the research on women's political involvement in Columbus for, and so she did, Women of the Chattahoochee Valley as a curatorial intern for the Columbus Museum last summer. And today she's coming to us live from Charlotte, North Carolina, where she's about to begin classes at UNC Charlotte to pursue an MA in history with a concentration in public history. So Sylvia, I'm so excited you're with us today. I'm going to put you on the spot. What was your kind of favorite part or the most interesting thing you learned as part of working on this exhibit last summer?
I think the most exciting part and interesting part was basically learning what I didn't know. I mean, like everyone else that's, been to school in Georgia, have Georgia studies. And we really did not talk about the contributions of women. And I did not hear about Augusta Howard until becoming an intern for the Columbus Museum. I think finding her and being able to see her dress at the museum and learning about her life and her quirk was one of the most interesting things. She was an amazing woman for her time and even now, and a trailblazer. And I'm glad that there's going to be a marker acknowledging her presence and her work and the work of other women in the area.
Yeah, she's a really fascinating figure, and I'm excited to talk a little bit more about her. We also want to thank our partners, Historic Columbus, today, and they actually did the yeoman's work, or the women's work, I should say, of getting this marker together along with the great work of Dr. Virginia Causey. And we'll be hearing from them at the end of our program for the official marker dedication. But now I do believe that we are ready for that greeting from Lisa Goodwin from the City of Columbus.
Good afternoon. We're excited to be a part of the Women's Suffrage Movement Monument unveiling ceremony. I greet you this afternoon on behalf of the Honorable Mayor Skip Henderson, our Honorable Mayor Pro Tem Gary Allen, our 10 members of City Council, and City Manager Isaiah Hughley. We join the Historic Columbus Foundation, Dr. Virginia Causey, and the supporters of the women's suffrage movement, who founded the Georgia Association here in Columbus. Because of the brave, selfless acts of the countless number of supporters, the women of Columbus, Georgia in 1921 could finally have a voice through their vote and soon became a major political force. In the words of our founding fathers, who proclaimed that all men and women are created equal, that they are endowed by their Creator with certain inalienable rights, that among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. Again, congratulations on the founding of the Georgia women's suffrage movement here in this place we call home, Columbus, Georgia.
Thanks for that, Lisa, and to the City of Columbus for their support of this project. You'll see a little bit later when we get to the unveiling and dedication that the marker is actually located at the Government Center downtown. So we're going to go ahead and get started with our conversation, and just so everybody knows the format of our program, Sylvia and I are going to have a conversation. We've agreed on some questions ahead of time, and we're going to talk through those. for about 25 or 30 minutes, and then we will have a time for open Q&A. So if you have questions that you think of, you can submit them if you're in Zoom via the Q&A function that you have at the bottom of your screen. If you are joining us via Facebook, you can submit those questions via a Facebook comment on the live stream, and one of our great museum staff members will relay those questions to us. So we'll go ahead and get started. So Sylvia, first question goes to you. And one of the great things that you did research on last summer was really the entire arc of women's political power in Columbus. And what you found out was that even before women earned the vote, they found ways to exercise political power. How did women influence Columbus's development in the 19th and early 20th centuries?
So yes, even before gaining the right to vote, women primarily exercised political power through women's clubs, church-sponsored aid societies, and women's auxiliary clubs, which were female counterparts to male social clubs. For the mid-1800s, church-sponsored groups and auxiliary clubs were the most popular forms for women's political involvement. In these groups, women could get involved in education and community improvement initiatives. For example, women in the Jewish Ladies Aid Society served underserved residents in Columbus through donations and programming like the Milk Fund. And then there were also other church groups and societies which helped raise funds to organize a public library in the mid-19th century, and then also raise funds to purchase locomotives for the new railway in the city of Columbus in 1851. And then there were also women's clubs, which became more popular in the mid-19th century. And you could see more and more women's clubs and organizations that were separate from the church and these auxiliary clubs. It allowed them great opportunity for higher forms of leadership. And in Columbus, you had branches of the Federation of Women's Club, who initiated public health services in the area, including building free medical and dental clinics and creating the local health department. And then there was also a branch of the Federation of Colored Women's Club, which, like the white counterparts, enacted similar public health reforms serving African American community in the Columbus area. And they also filled in gaps in the lack of recreational spaces for African Americans, building parks and other places of leisure for that community. And then there was the Women's Christian Temperance Union. There were two chapters in Columbus, the Columbus Legion and the Rose Hill Legion. And of course, other than their temperance mission, they also supported legislation to make education compulsory in Georgia, and also supported legislation to raise the age of consent from 10 years old to 18 years of age. And these groups were really instrumental in women's political involvement in the Columbus area before 1920 in an informal way.
I really loved all the research you did on this. A couple of things really stood out to me. The purchase of the locomotives. I think that's great.
Yes. Because you can really see the different ways and different sections of the public sphere that they were really targeting, which was amazing.
Yeah, I think you think about railroads as this male domain, but in this instance,
right,
women are stepping up and going, no, we think this is important for the city, and so we're going to make sure it gets done. I also thought the research you did on the Women's Christian Temperance Union here in Columbus was so interesting, because they have this really interesting platform where they're advocating for prohibition legislation and some really strict government regulation in ways that we have rejected now, but they're also at the forefront of saying, no, every child needs to go to school, and that it's not okay to marry a 10-year-old, that a 10-year-old cannot legally consent. So those are really great and important reforms that I'm glad they were part of.
Yeah, thank you. And so a question to you. This marker specifically honors Columbus's Augusta Howard as the founder of the Georgia Women's Suffrage Association. Can you tell us more about her?
So Augusta Howard is one of my favorite Columbus characters. She was born here in Columbus in 1865. And her interest in the suffrage movement came because her mother was widowed at a fairly young age. And when Augusta's father passed away, she and her sisters realized that her mother was responsible for paying all these taxes that were levied upon her by the state of Georgia for their father's business interest. And they and their mother came to believe that it was quite unfair that she had to pay these taxes and abide by these laws that were established by a state legislature and a state government, that she had absolutely no role in being able to vote for who her representatives were or truly have any voice in government. It's kind of comes back to this Revolutionary War idea of taxation without representation. So in 1890, when Augusta is 25 years old, she and her mother and her sisters found the Georgia Woman Suffrage Association. And Augusta's really the driving force behind that, but I also want to give a shout out to her mother, Anne Jane Lindsay Howard, and her Augusta's sisters, Antoinette Rutherford Howard, Alice E. Howard, Claudia Howard Maxwell, and Miriam Howard DuBose. These women, especially Augusta, were very involved in the state suffrage movement, and they also become involved in the national women's suffrage movement. So in 1894, the National American Women's Suffrage Association, which is a very long and wordy name because it's a merger, which is why you get both national and American in the same organizational name. They hold a conference in Washington, D.C. in 1894, and Augusta and her sisters really helped push to have that the next year's convention in 1895 take place in Georgia. At that convention, Miriam Howard delivers a speech in which she notes that among Georgia's curiosities were men who love their women too deeply to accord them justice, and women who are taken in with such affection, which is a really interesting indictment. She also talked about the unique battle Southern suffragists were facing in advancing suffrage in their home states. I'm reading from Sylvia's excellent essay here, in which they were forced to contend with the idealized image of the Southern belle and the reality of most women's situations, which by the turn of the century was not necessarily that of the Southern belle. So in 1895, this national convention takes place in Atlanta. There are women from 39 states there, including leaders such as Susan B. Anthony and Carrie Chapman Catt. After the convention, Augusta Howard brings Susan B. Anthony back to Columbus to give a speech. She stays in the Howard family home, which was located out on Talbotton Road, east of the Columbus city limits at the time. She gives this speech in Columbus, which is not necessarily well received by everyone, but she does speak and people attend and hear her talk. Something interesting about Augusta is we know that she was this really controversial figure. Sylvia mentioned, I think when we were chatting earlier, just a few minutes ago, that the museum has on display right now the dress that Augusta Howard wore at that National Suffrage Convention in 1895. But Augusta did not always wear dresses. She wore trousers. She was a vegetarian. She, at different times, both declared herself to be an atheist, but she also dabbled in spiritualism. And she never got married and was not very interested in that. By 1900, her brothers were really concerned about how influential Augusta was in the women's suffrage movement. You have to remember her other sisters who got involved were married, they had children, so there was a little bit more, certainly at the time it would have been expected to them to focus on their domestic responsibilities as well as their suffrage activities. But Augusta was unmarried, and so her brothers controlled her finances. And they eventually chose to cut her off financially, essentially, so that She had no money to travel or to engage in these activities, and she eventually becomes a recluse in the family home, living by herself after her mother dies. It is beyond the purview of this program today, but there is a really fascinating incident where she is put on trial for shooting a young boy who trespassed on her property. So you supposedly fired a warning shot, but the warning shot hit him and he fell out of a tree and bled all the way as he walked home. She was found guilty, and then you get into this really interesting situation where she's found guilty after she goes on the stand for 3 hours and does herself no favors. She kind of goes on a rant both about how she's considered a second-class citizen because she's a woman and her brothers have stifled her. But also she talks about how her family is one of the best families in Columbus, and how can you do this to her? She's such a respected member of society. So I always say that Augusta is not very egalitarian in her views. She thought that women had the right to vote, but I think what she really meant was that women who looked like her and moved in her social circle should have the right to vote. So she doesn't do herself any favors. She's found guilty, and then her brothers are horrified that their sister might go to prison, and so they start this letter writing campaign to the governor saying that basically she is mentally unstable and that she should be found not guilty by reason of insanity. And they get all their business associates and wealthy friends to write letters to the governor saying that he needs to commute her sentence. And then Augusta, for her part, has her friends mount a letter writing campaign saying that her guilty verdict should stand because she is not mentally incompetent, she is in her right mind, and she wants to accept those consequences. Ultimately, as you might have been able to predict, her brothers, with all the influential friends, won out. The governor did commute her sentence by reason of insanity, and she essentially goes into the custody of her brothers. They whisk her away to New York City, and that's where she lives until 1934. So we're not sure if she did vote. She certainly did not vote here in Columbus. She is buried in Linwood Cemetery, and if you would like a field trip, I highly recommend everyone to go find her tombstone. Her friends got together and raised money to pay for it, and across the front of it, it has her name, some really great text about her life, and then in these big block letters it says, "Martyred." To be clear, she died of natural causes. She was not poisoned or murdered or anything that we know of. But clearly her friends felt that her life's work was cut short, and that her quality of life was really affected by her brothers choosing to stifle her suffrage activism. So really a great, fascinating story. The historic marker only scratches the surface. So the marker also mentions prominent Columbus businessman G. Gunby Jordan and his support for women's suffrage. And Sylvia, we were actually talking before the program, you've learned even a little bit more information about this aspect of the movement. But what have you learned about G. Gunby Jordan's involvement in this movement and the role of male allies in the women's suffrage fight in Georgia?
So Gunby Jordan, he was a very vocal advocate for suffrage. In an important piece of literature published by the Georgia Women's Suffrage Association called "The Prominent Georgia Men in Favor of Women's Suffrage," men like Jordan talked about the hypocrisy of denying women the vote and expecting them to pay taxes and follow laws that they could not vote on. And besides being very vocal in their support of suffragists, they also donated money to the Suffrage Association and the Equal Suffrage League, and began aiding in other ways, particularly in the early 1900s. Men like Leonard Grossman, who I had learned was an attorney in Atlanta who offered his legal counsel to the Georgia Women's Suffrage Association in order to draft suffrage legislation to present to the General Assembly. And I also learned that there was a male pro-suffrage organization that was formed in 1913 called the Georgia Men's League for Women's Suffrage. And so you had these, I was pleasantly surprised by the evidence of male allies and particularly Georgian support in Columbus because Howard and her sisters and other suffragists in the city faced really negative backlash, like you said, with her brothers in her family and outside community, stating that they should not state these things, they should not want these things, they should be within the home and exercise the power from there. And they had other men in opposition of that stance, which was, I think, really critical to the push of the suffrage movement in Georgia and in the South in general. And there was also other strategies that, of course, the women in Columbus took that was outside the male support. And so for you, what strategies did Columbus women use to advocate for the vote and encourage voter registration?
So here I, again, want to give a shout out to Dr. Virginia Causey, who couldn't join us today, but did such wonderful work in helping to get this marker erected and dedicated, and has really helped tell the story of Augusta Howard and women's suffrage here in Columbus. I'm pulling from her excellent History of Columbus, Red Clay, Whitewater, and Blues here. But it's really interesting in that we have this beginning of the women's suffrage movement in Georgia, in Columbus in the 1890s. And that's what the marker celebrates. And then it becomes a little bit quiet, but then in the 19-teens, do you really get this resurgence of activism and activity. So Sylvia talked a lot about G. Gun B. Jordan and male support. By 1912, many of the elite members of Columbus society, both men and women, were in favor of women's suffrage by 1912. 1913, the Muskogee Equal Franchise League is started. Equal franchise is another word for the vote. In May of that year, in May of 1914, they hold their first Women's Rights Parade, which feature automobiles with yellow ribbons proclaiming votes for women. They held card parties, tea dances, and suffrage schools. I'd like to go to a suffrage school. They circulated petitions and sold baked goods in the city market. Remember that part about the city market. Starting on February 16th of 1914, they also wrote a weekly column for the Columbus Ledger newspaper called Equal Franchise. And they actually convinced the paper to run a special edition on women's suffrage in that same year, with comments by local women leaders, Gun B. Jordan, and also Frank J. Dudley, so another early male ally there. And then I would also note, we talked a little bit at the beginning of the program about when the Tennessee's ratification actually goes into effect, which is August 26, 1920. And on August 28th, the Muskogee Equal Franchise League, I'm quoting from Virginia's book here, asked churches, factories, and railroads to sound bells and whistles at noon to salute women's right to vote. But the city was quiet, leading the Equal Franchise League president, Anna Griffin, to claim that the suffragists were treated like snakes in Ireland. So certainly not a warm reception by everyone for women's right to vote here. It's also interesting to note that Georgia is one of two states where women could not actually vote in 1920 because the registration deadline had already passed by the time that Georgia deigned to put that into law, deigned to properly apply the law. So it wasn't until January 18th, 1921, that Muskogee County began accepting voter registrations from women. And at that point, the Equal Suffrage League turned into the League of Women Voters, which was active in Columbus for many years. And the League gave out stickers to every woman who registered to vote, which read, "A woman in this house has registered to vote. thereby assuming the responsibilities of citizenship. And I said, come back to the city market, I just want to point out one of the very first ways in which Columbus women exercised their political power was that in May of 1920, the mayor and city council had voted to demolish the historic city market, which operated on First Avenue beginning shortly after the Civil War, and really was a wonderful way for both white and Black women to sell produce and goods, especially women who were not of the elite social classes, but had gardens or other goods that they produced that they could sell directly to people there. And many of the members of the Federation of Women's Clubs here in Columbus rallied and said that the city market should be saved. They did quite a bit of political action around that, and the city market reopened in April 1921, and there was a big parade led by the women of the city. Now, it's worth noting that that only lasted for another couple of years because business went down again, unfortunately. But I think it's interesting that women did not hesitate to make their voice heard locally. They got the vote and jumped right in and started doing all kind of work, which leads me to my next question for Sylvia. We've talked about the struggle to get the vote, but what have been some other notable political firsts for Columbus women since 1920?
Yeah, so like you said, women jumped in head first once gaining the vote. And once gaining the vote, of course, they wasted no time in running for official roles in the government. So some notable firsts include Miss Edwina Wood, who was a public school teacher in Columbus. She became the first member of the Columbus School Board and the only woman to hold that position in Georgia in 1921. Anna Griffin became the first woman in Muscogee County elected to the newly formed City Commission of Columbus in November 1921. And Mildred Stansel Grimes became the first woman in Muscogee County to serve on a jury in 1955. This was, of course, after a long battle and petitioning the governor of Georgia to allow women to serve on a jury. And then Love Tolbert was the first woman elected to the General Assembly from Muscogee County in 1933. And Rose Strong became the first African-American woman in 1984 to be elected to the City Council of Columbus. And we are still making first in the 2000s with Teresa Tomlinson becoming the first woman mayor in Columbus in 2011. And of course, there are many other firsts that we still have to tackle, but we've made a lot of headway considering where we started, and the fight is still continuing on.
When you were doing the research for this exhibit and you particularly found the first woman juror, I thought that was so interesting that that was specifically noted, and also that it took so much longer until the mid-50s, even after women getting the right to vote, women having the right to serve on a jury, because certainly women were being charged with crimes. They were not exempt from criminal prosecution. So again, just as we think about with issues of racial justice, it's that phrase, the right to a jury of your peers when you're being evaluated, and who are your peers and what does that really and truly look like. So I do want to talk about race a little bit because we know that not all women were in favor of suffrage before the 19th Amendment was passed, and that was especially true in the South, not just in the South, but especially in the South. So Sylvia, first, generally, what were some of the most common arguments against passage of the 19th Amendment? And specifically, how did the possibility of Black women voting become a rallying cry for both sides of the debate?
Yeah, so like you said, not all Southern women were supportive of the 19th Amendment, and there were a variety of reactions to the idea of female suffrage in the South. It's important to note that the suffrage movement had a delayed entry into the South because it was seen as an import from the North and the West in order to upset the Southern social order. And that was a great fear of theirs, this idea of suffrage destabilizing the family unit in the South if women could vote. Another argument was that women did not need the vote because they were able to wield power from their positions as wives and mothers, from their position within the family. And suffrage was seen as an attack on Southern virtue and would cause the degradation of, quote, the fairer sex. And like in the North, most Southern suffragists were middle and upper class white women. Literature and speeches made by the Georgia Women's Suffrage Association did not address the realities of African American women or really working class women in Georgia in terms of class. That possibility of working class women gaining the vote, there was fear of that eroding the social hierarchy even more. And race really became a central issue in both pro-suffrage and anti-suffrage groups during the 1914 House Committee meeting. Pro-suffragists promoted the idea of enfranchising white women as a tool for white supremacy and to keep control of Southern politics, especially since the passage of the 15th Amendment, which granted African American men the right to vote, which did spread white fear in the South. And then there was also, on the other side, the anti-suffrage party used the possibility of African American women gaining the right to vote as a reason to deny them women suffrage for fear of widespread black suffrage, both men and women gaining that right to vote. And so, of course, this was an issue everywhere in the North, but like you said, particularly in the South, because that did play a key role, specifically, post-Reconstruction in the politics of the Southern region. It's a dark period in our history, but a very important one.
Yes, and if anyone has been reading or paying attention to kind of national commemorations of the women's suffrage movement, there's been a lot of discussion of the ways that Elizabeth Cady Stanton and Susan B. Anthony ultimately prioritized white women's right to vote over black men getting the right to vote. And also the fact that even though the 19th Amendment theoretically grants all women the right to vote, we know that it really takes until the 1960s and the Voting Rights Act for that to become a reality for all the women of our country.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. And so speaking on, race and voting, you did some research into voter suppression tactics, which kept many Black women from voting until 1965, like you said. How did they take action during the Civil Rights Movement?
So it's interesting, and there's also been a lot of discussion nationally in recent years about how African American men have long been seen as being at the forefront of the Civil Rights Movement, but we know that African American women drove a lot of that activity as well, even though they may have been behind the scenes sometimes. And so I wanted to share just a couple stories of Black women's involvement in the Civil Rights Movement here in Columbus. The historic marker that we're dedicating today is just a few steps away from a historic marker that recognizes Primus King and his legal battle, which ultimately helped lead to the end of the all-white primary here in Georgia and kind of at least set the stage for that particular form of legal discrimination to start going away in other southern states as well. That court case happened in the late 1940s. There were several different legal appearances before several different courts, and so that required raising money for all those appeals and all those different appearances in court. There was a group of African American professionals here in Columbus who helped raise money for that case and those appeals, not just from folks here in Columbus, but folks throughout Georgia, from Macon, from Valdosta, from our surrounding counties. And if you look at the stationery for that particular group as they were sending out those appeals, it is all men who are listed as the officers, all Black men, except for Lula Lunsford Huff, who was a very successful Black businesswoman here in Columbus. She helped fund the construction of a USO for African American soldiers during World War II. And she was also involved in helping raise funds for the Primus King voting rights case. So an example of indirect involvement, but certainly very significant. And you can think about the effect that her appeal and her conversation might have had on Black women in the Columbus area. A few years later, in 1958, when Martin Luther King Jr. visits Columbus for his only appearance here and gives a speech, there is a house bombing that night. And it happens at the home of Essie Mae Ellison on 5th Avenue. And Essie Mae Ellison had actually been threatened because she had purchased a home from a white woman. And that's what I think is so interesting about this story, is that this is a transaction between two women. Mrs. Gibson Brooks, a white woman, sells her home to Mrs. Essie Mae Ellison, an African-American woman. And the home was in an historically white neighborhood. Mrs. Ellison purchases this home on the edge of the neighborhood as a Black woman, and both Mrs. Brooks and Mrs. Ellison are threatened for this sale and for kind of breaking the unwritten rules of redlining in Columbus and which neighborhoods are okay for certain people to live in. And Mrs. Brooks began receiving threatening telephone calls. And then on July 1st, 1958, Mrs. Ellison's home was actually firebombed. And if you visit the exhibition we have up at the museum right now, you can see a picture from the Ledger Enquirer of the home there. And I love this quote that Mrs. Ellison gave to the reporter. Thankfully, no one was killed. The house still stood, but there was significant damage. And a reporter asked her if she planned to move. And she said, "No, I'm not going to move. I can run, but I can't hide." And I just think that's a really great encapsulation of the everyday ways in which women take bold stands and choose to live their lives for the good of themselves and for their families. And then one other notable incident in 1961, there is collective action here in Columbus by several local college students who participated in nonviolent sit-ins on the city buses that ultimately led to the successful desegregation of those buses. And among those who participated were three young women, among them Bunkie McClung. And she gave a really great interview with the Ledger Enquirer a few years ago about her experience. And I encourage anyone listening to take the opportunity and take the time to seek that out and learn about her experience as a woman being active in the civil rights movement. And she also stayed active in politics through the late 20th century. And so, Sylvia, I want to ask you, how did women locally shift their political activism toward fighting gender discrimination in the late 20th century?
Yes, so of course, after gaining the vote, women now had an official avenue to start fighting against some of the key issues that were affecting women. Even into the 60s and 70s, women lacked equal rights and personal freedom. So women could not open a bank account or apply for a credit card without her husband co-signing in the 70s. And women still continue to join and exercise their right to political voice in societies like the American Association of University Women and the League of Women Voters. Both groups helped place pressure on Governor Talmadge to sign a bill giving women the right to serve on a jury in 1953, which gave women another steps towards gaining equal rights, like we talked about earlier, Mildred Stansel Grimes. Even in the 50s, women were still trying to make headway into really becoming a first-class citizen. The AAUW also advocated for women and children, forming Columbus Alliance for Battered Women's clubs, and hosted workshops for local women and girls on computer literacy, career choices, and a variety of other subjects aimed at getting women prepared to enter into official leadership roles. and that included encouraging women to pursue higher education. And they were also vocal supporters of the Equal Rights Amendment. And then there was also the League of Women Voters, who encouraged the mayor at the time to establish a commission on the status of women in the 70s to conduct research and really address the status of women working in the government. The study found that women working in the city of Columbus were still facing disparities in pay and job promotion, and they enacted several different programs and initiatives in order to not only get women into higher paying positions in the city government, but also to try to close the wage gap, which of course we are still trying to close that wage gap. But this is really showing how once women gained the right to vote, they also began doing basically what they have done before gaining the right to vote, looking within the communities and trying to address the gaps that they saw not only for themselves, but for future girls and women and for the wider benefit of the community, which I found was truly astonishing, particularly in the 70s. And when I read that, I was a little thrown back.
Yes, thinking about, and brought into the collection a couple months ago, a early CB&T charge card advertising booklet, and it's entirely targeted towards women about this is an easy way for you to go shopping, and you can put off paying bills if your husband doesn't get paid until the end of the month, et cetera, et cetera. And it's fascinating to see that and think about that in the 1960s, people are cognizant of the fact, I mean, before that, that women hold a lot of the power of the purse in households as far as making purchasing decisions, but women were not able to apply for credit cards on their own for several decades later. So that's, yeah, it's really fascinating to see that. So we do want to open up the floor for some questions from the audience. I see a couple questions already. Again, if you'd like to submit those in the Q&A in Zoom or in the comments section on Facebook. And while you're doing that, Sylvia, I'll just wrap up this part of the conversation. What unanswered questions do you still have about the fight for women's suffrage and political power in Columbus?
I think most of my questions revolve around really finding the voices of Asian, Latinx, and other women of color, besides, of course, including Black women, but also just opening up to a greater variety. I know they were there in Columbus. I know they were also working towards these issues. The AAUW was trying to, in the 80s and 90s, trying to diversify their membership. They were making success in that. I really want to find those voices and get their perspective on this fight for suffrage, particularly in the South, and due to their status, how do the intersection of those, you know, being a woman of color and being a woman intersect and change their perspective on this narrative?
Yeah, that's a fantastic answer. I co-sign completely, wanting to find more of the voices of women of color. As you mentioned earlier, we know that there were African-American women's clubs here that were very active. We know that Black women were active in making their communities a better place here locally. And so it just seems very likely that at least some of those women were also interested in the fight for suffrage. But unfortunately, we haven't found those voices yet in the available records. So we hope that we will someday. And if someone is out there watching and you have a treasure trove, please contact us.
Please.
And I think also knowing that women today are such a huge part of the electorate. I was just reading something the other day about how I think it's consistently for decades now, 1 million more women have voted in elections nationally than men. Women are really driving the electorate. I think that story of women's involvement is just going to continue to grow, both locally and nationally. So we have a couple questions, and Sylvia, this first one is specifically directed for you, but I will, I may pop in as well. When Augusta Howard was alive, she was believed by some to be mad. That's in quotes. In your research, have you seen other evidence of women being accused of being mentally ill when they were advocating for equality? How do you see that history informing our present day lives?
Ooh, definitely in the anti-suffrage group. The newspapers, of course, we've all seen political cartoons and whatnot. They portrayed the women as almost animalistic. You know, they're outside of the genteel lady. They're crazy. They don't know what they're talking about. They need a husband to really settle them down, a family to be a driving force in their lives. And I think that does, you know, play into the narrative of women's lives, this idea, oh, if you're not doing this and this, you're crazy. When you're stepping outside the norm, you're always going to get that sort of backlash. And I think that does inform kind of the current narrative when, you know, a female politician is seen as being passionate, she can also be seen as being crazed, which is unfortunate, of course, but it does harken back to, you know, the anti-suffrage sentiment in the 19th and 20th centuries.
Yes, I was thinking about specifically one of my favorite anti-suffrage cartoons, which it seems weird to say that, but it's this really adorable image of a little kitten, and it has a women's suffrage ribbon, and it has a hat, and I think it has a protest sign propped against its little paw or something, and it's votes for women. There's actually no caption on the cartoon, but you see this imagery of cats coming up a lot in regards to anti-women's suffrage, and I think it's all tied in with this bad stereotype of the crazy cat lady, right? That women who want to vote aren't fulfilled by their domestic responsibilities, and they're, like you said, it's a little bit animalistic, or it's always, it's usually kittens, not adult cats. It seems to be very small cats. So this idea that women either we're animalistic or we are childlike and children and we don't understand the responsibility. So yes, I think that comes through a lot. And like you said, that type of gendered language, you see that continue to play out a lot, unfortunately. And it comes up when we're talking about women politicians of any party. It is a bipartisan / nonpartisan issue, unfortunately. And I was thinking about lots of times women politicians are called ambitious, and that's it's derogatory that they would be ambitious, but it's never bad if you call a man ambitious. And Jane Wilson of the local League of Women Voters has added in the chat interesting comments recently about better results during the pandemic in countries headed by women. And that's true, thinking about New Zealand, Germany, and Taiwan, just off the top of my head.
Australia.
Women's involvement in government there too. We have another question. Is Columbus indicative of other southern cities? Seems to have been a little more forward thinking as far as women's suffrage and women's rights. I would say in the large part, for the large part, we're kind of in the mainstream. I think we are more ahead of a lot of other places, particularly during the 20th century. You see a lot of women's suffrage activism in the immediate decade or two before the 19th Amendment centered in Atlanta. And so Atlanta gets a lot of the attention for that. And I think certainly after Augusta Howard is kind of shut out, the leaders of the movement are coming from there. There's also some great involvement happening by both white and Black women in Augusta as well as Atlanta. But the Atlanta Journal-Constitution did a really great kind of look at women's suffrage leaders in the state last week, and it was a really great statewide overview. They talked about Augusta Howard, they talked about Adela Hunt Logan, who was mentioned in our exhibition at the museum, who was born in Sparta, but really works a lot in Tuskegee. And so it's great to see that acknowledgement that it's not just in Atlanta. So as with most things in Georgia, Atlanta gets the lion's share of the attention, and certainly a lot of the leaders and the driving force of these movements is there. But there's a lot of activity elsewhere too. So I think in some ways Columbus is at the forefront. And, you know, for example, Sylvia mentioned we elected our first woman mayor in 2011. I think there are a lot of cities in Georgia that have elected 0 women mayors. So that's interesting to think about. But like she said, we also still have a long ways to go in other things. Sylvia, do you want to add anything there?
Yeah, 100% agree with what you said, especially with, you know, sometimes Atlanta can be the focal point. How recently we kind of, you know, zoomed out a bit to include other Georgia cities. But like you said, I think we are pretty up there. We have had a lot of firsts before some of the other Georgia cities outside of Atlanta, and I think that it's good that we're gaining that recognition, because the work that we women have done in Columbus is really important, and influences other Georgia cities.
Yes, absolutely. So we are just about to conclude our discussion today. Those were great questions. Thanks to all who asked and those who watched. But before we sign off, we have the official dedication of the Women's Suffrage Marker. It is downtown or uptown in Columbus at the corner, basically at the corner of 10th Street and 2nd Avenue. So if you're local and you want to go check it out, it is down there. And Sylvia, I want to thank you again for joining us today. It's been so fun to chat with you.
Thank you for inviting me. This was fun.
Yeah, absolutely. And thanks to all of you for watching, and thanks to Historic Columbus for partnering with us on this program. And now I am going to turn it over to the women of Historic Columbus.
Hello everyone, I'm Elizabeth Walden, Executive Director of Historic Columbus, and we are excited to dedicate and unveil our newest historic marker celebrating the women's suffrage movement. We are so thankful to Dr. Virginia Causey, who was the driving force behind this marker, and she wrote the text for it. The marker celebrates Columbus as the birthplace of the women's suffrage movement and the incredible contributions of Augusta Howard and Gunby Jordan. Historic Columbus is very grateful to the over 30 women and men who generously donated to make this marker a reality. We are also very thankful to the City of Columbus for all of their help, and Deputy City Manager Lisa Goodwin for her wonderful support. Finally, we would like to extend our sincerest appreciation to the Columbus Museum, because without them today would not happen. Rebecca Bush and the museum staff made today possible. We know that you have enjoyed Rebecca and Sylvia's program, but we do have one last thing to do. Ladies? Please come by and see the Women's Suffrage Historic Marker in person here on the Government Center block on the 10th Street side across from the Springer. She's now a reality, so we again thank you so much for being with us today.